Back at the apartment, I would try to explain what was happening to me at the club. Well, I explained some of it, but then we were both as bad as each other, with the compulsions and addictions. Then eventually she left me. If you've lost your point on a love triangle, I recommend that you visit the Wicked Witch of West London. Those early morning journeys home from Bodycore took me right past the smirking hologram that enchanted her front doors. This was the place where I would try to reconnect with my old Premier League friends. At first I thought that I'd acquired some kind of social disease. So heavy was the effect that I had to go out every night after work, and imagined that if I were to go home a single night, I would start spreading boring gossip to my wallpaper. Once I went home for 2 nights in succession, and I could have sworn that the wallpaper had a nervous breakdown and stripped itself off the walls. In reality, I know now that it was much more complex than that. But what does it matter now? I just knew at that time that I had to find an excuse to play the game, and that to me, there were no poor tables. Every single table was a winner. To me, even with all of its risks, gaming brought art and life together. There was a vain attempt to act in some sensible space between the two, but it was difficult because when the West End shows closed and the stage doors opened, all of the dreamers and show people went to Cleo's. On the nights that I did make it all the way home from work, I would shower luxuriously, pull on my cleanest shirt, lock the door to the apartment, walk out of Garland Beach Terrace and onto the King's Road. To follow my instincts and superstitions, I would never step on the cracks in the pavement and would always stay on the right-hand side of the street, so that I could check in with Paul, the late-night grocer, a young man full of intrigue who wore a peacock haircut and pretty green shoes from Carnaby Street. The racks were filled with exotic liquor miniatures and beautifully engineered electronic cigarettes. And there he would stand behind the counter, singing edgy political songs at the far end of an Aladdin's cave of brand labels. All I could ever do was nod along in agreement with his pearls of perception. But I never listened when he tried to warn me about Cleo's. I would just smile and walk out of the shop, a satisfied smoker, breezing off in a cloud of puff to an evening of fetid freedom, manfully striding past the handsome young Turks who sat outside the cafe playing backgammon, drinking old-fashioned coffee and smoking apple tobacco from a bubbling shisha pipe. Onward I would march past the Teddy Boy Outfitter and movie poster store, across the lights, through rebellious car sounds and past Sloane Square's black glossy doors and white pillars, to check my reflection in the window of Burble's jewellery shop, my mojo rising as I stepped under the glass arch of West End Arcade. I tapped along with those tiny mosaic tiles beneath my feet 100 times, and each time I noticed something new. The eyes of Aphrodite, the flowers of Dionysius, the mother of pearl inside the shell of Venus, and Achilles' heel, white fan-tailed doves resting on the botanical vine with tendrils that grew into spirals, circling overhead in a wake's vortex. And the moon, the most fluid, white, liquid moon, the brightest I'd ever seen, pouring in through the skylight. On that night, I heard the haunting whistling of another night owl, just like me, a smudgy-eyed, retro-romantic, another martyr to the glory, waiting behind me to use the hole in the wall. The music that poured into the arcade from Cleo's was right on par with a religious cult, unstoppable rhythm guitars and a tenor sax solo that made my feet tap out a riff walking up the arcade. The thrashing and pounding of a brass gong were both a battle cry and a welcoming call to the shrine. I couldn't think until I got there. The dancers outside became national stars over that season. It was easy to see why. They'd been encouraged to interact with the guests. Dressed in animal skin lingerie, they weaved their way in and out of the flamethrowers. On the weekend, the younger set came pouring in from the surrounding boroughs. In crowds from Richmond, Barking and Dagenham would hang around, posing 10 deep outside the club, spilling into the road, stalling traffic and annoying the coppers assigned to move their swelling numbers along. With their white shirts flashed diode blue by the headlights of electric muscle cars, they created such a frisson of tension and malaise in the warm night air. It was that same attitude that set the scene for the balmy nights ahead. Every nightclub worth the plastic has an entrance policy, and God's Gate, as it was affectionately known, was no exception. Given worked the heavy bronze doors, a twiggy-haired chooser who would perfectly match people to their faces in a copy of Rolling Stone magazine, with a black fingernail blessing pages and foreheads as he moved along the line. His peeps believed so deeply in his personal touch that it became a holy rite of passage. With those pretty brown eyes, ashen blue feather in his hat, and the natural ability to arouse sympathy, I thought there was definitely something of the Romany about him. Rested somewhere between a man and woman, with all his preferences bound by musical ties and the invisible shackles of love, loosely caressed by a leotard that could have easily passed off as a little pink dress. He bounced around on a drum beat that pounded him senseless, treading that difficult path which circles social attitudes, celebrating everything glamorous and outrageous. To be fair, as far as bus stop queues go, Givens was one of the most curious. He would fall in for a quick chat before fainting away to the next in line. If the signals were correct, he would hold up the back of his hand for you to kiss. He had clearly made a pact with the rainbow's end. The contract fluttered from his bag in the form of a turquoise butterfly. "You're a butterfly collector," one reveller shouted from the queue. "Yes, they follow me everywhere, darling. Descend upon me from the trees." As the butterfly made for an open window above the crowd, Given called after it, "No, go, be free, and don't forget to fall in love. You don't have that long." New York has the Plaza, Rio de Janeiro the Copacabana. But in terms of keeping their customers satisfied, Cleopatra's hotel, nightclub and casino took some beating. The Pride of Chelsea welcomed some of the world's biggest stars and most powerful individuals, boasted over 100 rooms, 13 glass pyramids, and the comfiest indoor poolside mattresses this side of Harrods. In that little corner of the city, the nouveau riche were checking in droves. The place had become a symbol of economic extremes, with the clientele seemingly hell-bent on blowing as much money as possible in a single session. The foyer looked like a live audition for a travelling zoo. Vidal, the Merton leopard, had exchanged his spots for urban camouflage and a boutique job on Conduit Street. Suki, the saber-toothed kitten, was in a relationship with a Harley Street dentist. The fangs were a coming-of-age gift, and at their most gamey with the emerald green contact lenses she wore to complete the effect. The fake ID her brother made for her was the icing on her birthday cake, 19 candles wide. There was Sheikh Albar, or Abdul No Socks as we called him, and his minders, the Samoan twins. A real live sheikh from the Emirates, who lost so much money at Cleo's they printed commemorative blue chips with his face on both sides. I'm sure that they're legal tender somewhere in the Middle East. Most of the girls in the queue were there to meet a rich man. Florence was no exception. A fire eater from Cirque du Soleil, she had been based in Los Angeles, and whilst living undercover as a down-and-out selling star guides on Rainbow Road, she met an oilman whom she had brought along, on a chain. When he got up from his knees, she granted one short draw on a cigarette, then it was back on all fours for the rest of the routine. She kept some pretty bad company. They all lived 6 to a room in a compact studio in Bayswater. All in all, it was a motley crew of complete strangers who collectively brought about a sense of forgiveness, reconciliation, and love in a family way. They were thinking about opening the night up to normal people, but that would take the queue right around the corner and really scupper the theme. For Abide, the waiting was boring. She was out and proud and somewhere in between worlds. How could she ever push that first experience aside? She'd been curious ever since. She didn't want the frugal life, she wanted it on her terms. She was always looking for people who intrigued her, never waited to see if they were attracted to her. Of course they would be. You only had to see a bide, and in an instant she knew you. She would shift around as you moved, follow you. I couldn't see her eyes, I could feel them on me. She selected me in the queue, wrote her name across my back with a fingertip, told me how wasted I looked, danced with me politely, and then closer and more serious. Within no time, she was pressing herself against my groin, kissing me deeply. To help seal the deal, she began whispering that she was looking for someone that she could pursue with all her heart, even if it was for the briefest of times. She told me that the first time she was on a love triangle, it was like losing her virginity, and she can't resolve her complex love life. I couldn't have handled a woman like that, way too fluent in the language of sex. It would have been another one of those burlesque friendships that went physically toxic. With her imported ideals from the Hamburg school of seduction, she kept coming out in Cleos. She soon breezed off and found herself on another tripod of mutually destructive behaviour. Her and two dancers made one by the eternal mystery of bad love. She says it brings out the Christmas feeling.